Welcome to Northern Mystery Archives. Here, we don't soften the truth, and we don't skip the details. We investigate the forgotten files from the far north of Canada, the disappearances that were quietly shelved, the settlements that faded from every map, the transmissions that were never meant to be heard again. In this channel, nothing is hidden. Every fragment, every silence, every erased trail is examined with the seriousness these cases deserved but never received. If you value cold, atmospheric, minimalist investigations into the unexplained wilderness of the North, you're in the right place. Subscribe, stay close, and step with us into the files they hoped no one would ever revisit. Below, we will be speaking about the case Tristan Muir, late fall, 1960, vanished logging road encounter. It is thin, mislabeled, and out of sequence, tucked between heavier binders about accidents, fires, and routine missing persons. What makes it different is not what is there, but what is missing, and the way entire pages end mid-sentence. It is as if someone began to tell a story and then decided halfway through that the story should not exist. The cover sheet carries only a name, a season, and an imprecise time marker. Late fall, the year left blank, a northern district code that has since been reassigned to another region. The typed letters are faint, as if the ribbon of the machine had been near the end. There are pencil notes in the margins, some erased so firmly that the paper fibers have lifted and thinned. Inside, the first document is not a formal report, but a memorandum. It refers to a logging road no longer maintained, a spur cut into boreal forest for a camp that existed for less than a decade. The memo states that a man named Tristan failed to arrive at a rendezvous point after traveling alone along that road. No vehicle was recovered at the time the memo was drafted. The second page contradicts the first. On it, someone has written that the truck was later found, then crossed out the sentence with a single hard stroke. Below, another hand has added that all references to vehicle recovery are to be removed from circulation. In the lower corner, there is a notation about jurisdiction and media sensitivity. It is unusual language for a disappearance handled in a sparsely populated district. This file has no initial missing person form. There is no signed statement from family, no description of what Tristan was wearing, no list of scars or distinguishing marks. Instead, the earliest surviving narrative begins with the road, the thinning daylight, and the approach of winter. The person becomes secondary to the route he chose to travel and the land through which he passed. Later documents try to correct this absence. A typed sheet summarizes what little could be reconstructed about Tristan himself. He is described as accustomed to northern roads, familiar with logging operations and intermittent work in remote camps. There is a line about his comfort with driving alone for long distances, even in changing weather. Another note states that he was considered reliable by those who worked with him, reliable enough that his failure to appear was noticed within hours, not days. There is no mention of criminal history, substance dependence, or personal conflict that might suggest voluntary disappearance. The case, from its first surviving description, is framed as anomalous. The thinness of the file is misleading, because what remains appears to be the result of deliberate reduction. Staple holes in the corners show where entire sections once sat. Numbering on the pages jumps, leaving gaps where statements, maps, or photographs should be. On the inside back cover, there is the faint outline of a removed envelope, its adhesive never fully peeled away. What persists are fragments. A partial map of a decommissioned logging road network copied onto onion skin tracing paper. A summary of radio traffic that evening, rendered almost useless by thick black marker over key timestamps. A typed chronology with multiple amendments in handwriting that does not match any official signature in the file. The title, written across the spine in fading ink, is peculiar in its precision. It anchors the case to a season and an event, not simply to a missing person. Late fall vanished logging road encounter. Nan. The word encounter suggests that the focus was never only on Tristan's failure to arrive, but on something that occurred before he disappeared. Most missing person files from northern districts are banal in their structure. Arrival, last confirmed sighting, attempts at contact, search parameters, interviews, closure. This file does not follow that arc. It opens, instead, with a reference to a place that no longer appears on any publicly available map, and to a night when multiple recordings were made that no longer exist in full. In the months after the disappearance, an internal review appears to have taken place. One page, stamped as draft, states that procedures around isolated road patrols and radio monitoring may require revision. The recommendations have been redacted, while the justification paragraphs remain. Those paragraphs refer obliquely to unexplained pauses and partial transmissions. More than once, the file references a decision to avoid creating unnecessary concern for residents and seasonal workers. Yet at the time, the road in question was already being phased out. Traffic was minimal, the logging camp near its terminus effectively abandoned. Whatever concern was being managed did not relate to local populations in any conventional sense. What makes this case resurface today is not a new discovery in the field, nor a confession, nor a found object. It is the rediscovery of the file itself in an off-site storage room during a broader archival reorganization. A box marked for destruction was opened for spot inspection, and among tax schedules and outdated requisition forms, the Muir file was found. By then, the logging road had been erased by time, winter rains, and the slow reclaiming work of the boreal forest. Aerial imagery shows only faint linear discolorations, like old scars, crossing the dark green canopy. The camp that once justified the road's existence is now a scatter of unidentifiable debris under layers of moss. The people who drove that route regularly have aged, moved, or disappeared into other stories. The recovered file was never meant for public attention. Its survival seems accidental, caught between decisions made years apart by people who likely never met. And chose to diminish it, removing pages and obscuring lines. Another chose not to complete the destruction, leaving just enough for questions to remain. To understand what happened to Tristan, or at least to understand the context of his last journey, requires following the same road on paper that he followed in person. The investigation begins not with his biography, but with contour lines, snowfall averages, fuel ranges, and the unusual radio behavior documented on that particular evening. This is not a story of a sudden storm or a simple mechanical failure. Those possibilities were considered and, within the remaining notes, gradually set aside. The opening file, in its current stripped-down form, leaves us with a man whose life is mostly undocumented, traveling alone toward a camp that was nearly empty. Between his last confirmed point on a main highway and the place where the spur road turned to mud and ice, there is a stretch of land that seems to take on its own agency in the documents. Investigators return repeatedly to the same few kilometers, the same unmarked junction, the same stretch of road where the trees lean close. It is there, according to the surviving summaries, that something interrupted the ordinary. The logging road that defines this case existed for a brief period in the administrative sense, but on the ground, its impact lasted longer. Cut into the northern boreal forest, it began as a rough bulldozed path leading away from an already lonely highway. For several seasons, it was widened, graded, and graveled as far as the main camp. Beyond that, secondary spurs extended into the trees, narrower and more fragile. By the time of Tristan's journey, the road was already showing signs of neglect. Harvest quotas had shifted, mills had scaled back, and the camp straddling a remote lake was working on a skeleton crew. Official maintenance had been reduced to the bare minimum required to move the last stockpiles of timber out before winter locked the area down. Potholes formed faster than they could be filled, and drainage ditches clogged with fallen needles and branches. From the air, the main line looked like a pale thread pulling northward through an ocean of dark green. On the ground, it felt narrower than the map suggested, hemmed in by black spruce and jack pine, the tree line crowding close. The ditches were lined with alder and willow, the undergrowth dense enough that a few steps off the gravel left a person hidden from view. In late fall, the foliage had already turned, leaving a tangle of bare branches and frost burn. Weather records for the region during that general period show a typical pattern of late-season instability. Days hovered just above freezing, nights slipped well below. Snow fell and melted repeatedly, creating a cycle of slush and refreeze that turned less traveled surfaces into uneven sheets of ice. Fog formed over low, wet areas in the mornings and evenings, sometimes thick enough to swallow headlights. This part of the country lies far from major centers, in a zone of lakes, muskeg, and shallow rocky ridges. The soil is poor, the water table high, and the ground surface deceptive, firm one moment and sponge like a few meters away. Pockets of black water hide beneath mats of lichen and sphagnum. Old seismic lines and skidder tracks, grown in with saplings, still thread the bush in patterns no longer clear to those who do not work the land daily. The main highway nearest to the logging road is itself a marginal corridor. It sees bursts of transport traffic and the occasional long-distance traveler, but hours can pass without a single vehicle. Gas stations are few and closing times irregular, especially once the heaviest tourist flows have ended. In late fall, motels stand half empty, their parking lots edged with dirty snow pulled into ridges by plows. To reach the logging road, a driver heading north would pass a small maintenance yard and a former ranger station now used only for storage. A faded sign, once brightly reflective, marks the junction with a code name and a distance marker. By the time of Tristan's trip, locals knew that the sign was out of date, the distance to the camp no longer entirely accurate. Erosion and small washouts had shortened the usable length of the spur without any official revision. Radio coverage along the highway was patchy but functional, maintained primarily for emergency response and forestry coordination. Once a vehicle turned onto the logging road, however, the transmission pattern changed. The land's folds and the density of the trees created pockets where signal fell away unexpectedly. Dispatchers accustomed to this learned to interpret partial bursts, static and abrupt silences as part of normal operations. For those unfamiliar with these roads, the effect could be unnerving. The forest seemed to lean closer as the pavement gave way to gravel, then to a rougher, broken surface. Noise from the tires deepened from a smooth hum to a harsher grinding that vibrated through the steering wheel. At night, the headlights carved a narrow tunnel of visibility through the endless tree trunks. Near the midpoint between the highway and the camp, the road crossed several low-lying areas where water pooled. Culverts, some clogged, struggled to handle the constant shift between frozen and liquid states. Here, the shoulders were soft and deceptive, appearing solid yet collapsing under weight. Ruts from heavy trucks had hardened into ridges, channeling vehicles into specific tracks. Maps attached to the file show the road bending in gentle arcs rather than sharp turns. There are long, straight stretches where drivers could see ahead for a kilometer or more, and shorter segments where the view closed in quickly. One particular curve, marked with a penciled circle on the remaining map, appears to have drawn unusual attention during the investigation. It sits just beyond a small unmarked fork leading to an older, narrower roadbed that no longer appears on modern charts. The camp at the far end of the main spur was situated on the south shore of an elongated lake. The lake itself lies in a shallow glacial trough, its water dark and cold even in high summer. By late fall, a skin of ice often forms along the edges, thin enough to break but thick enough to trap fallen branches. Cabins and service buildings once lined the shore, but as operations wound down, many were boarded up or left partially dismantled. In years when the mill demanded full production, the camp could house dozens of workers. By the period in question, only a core crew remained, tasked with packing equipment, securing stores, and preparing the site for indefinite closure. Reports suggest that only a handful of people were present on the day Tristan was expected. Their statements, where they still exist, emphasize the quiet of the place and the sense of waiting for an ending. Away from the main buildings, a scattering of older structures marked earlier phases of use. A small fuel shed, a collapsed shack that had once been a line cabin, and a narrow dock that no longer reached the water at low levels. Beyond those, the bush closed in quickly. The distinction between human space and wilderness blurred only a few dozen meters from the lake shore. The entire area lies within a larger, loosely defined zone used by multiple agencies. Portions of it are labeled as wildlife management units, others as experimental forest plots, and some as proposed future parkland. In practice, the overlapping jurisdictions created a kind of administrative grey space. Responsibility for roads, structures, and signage shifted over time, leaving certain features in limbo. Those who worked seasonal jobs in the region often spoke of routes that existed more in memory than on paper. Old trap lines, temporary winter roads pushed across frozen bogs, abandoned cut blocks, accessible only by ATV. The logging road at the center of this case sat somewhere between those categories. Official enough to be mapped at one time, forgotten enough that no one updated its status when conditions changed. By late fall, daylight in this latitude is already shortened. The sun rises late and slides along a low path before dipping early behind the tree line. Even in clear weather, the hours of full illumination are limited. Cloud cover, common during transitional seasons, can make the day feel like an extended dusk. On the evening of Tristan's disappearance, utility logs show overcast conditions with light freezing drizzle in some zones. Visibility on the highway was acceptable, but on side roads, the combination of moisture and residual ground frost created a thin, nearly invisible glaze. In sheltered hollows, temperatures dropped faster once the sun went down. These microclimates could turn one bend in the road treacherous while the next remained relatively clear. The smell of this forest in late fall carries details that do not show up in reports. Wet needles, cold earth, and the faint mineral tang of ice forming on puddles. When wind moves through the canopy, it produces a distant, continuous hiss, punctuated by sharper creaks as trunks shift. In still moments, sound carries farther than expected, the crack of a branch echoing beyond its source. This is a landscape where being alone feels different than solitude elsewhere. The distances between occupied structures are measured in tens of kilometers. Lights from other human presence once off the highway become rare and isolated. A single cabin burning fuel at the edge of a lake might be the only visible sign of habitation for hours of driving. The logging road, as reconstructed from maps and testimony, passes near several small lakes and one wide marsh. This marsh, noted in a field sketch, is bordered by stunted tamarack and black spruce. Its surface, even when frozen, hides deep channels of water cut by ancient streams. Old equipment abandoned at its edge has sunk slowly over the years, leaving only fragments above the moss. An unmaintained road in such an environment does not simply remain as it was. Ruts fill with water, then sediment. Edges crumble under the weight of spring melt. Saplings colonize the center line, at first scattered, then dense enough to block passage. By the time aerial surveys are conducted decades later, only slight color differences and unexpected straight lines reveal where the gravel once lay. The setting of the Muir disappearance is therefore not just a backdrop. The core of any missing person case begins with the last confirmed movements. For Tristan, these movements can be reconstructed only through partial documentation. There is no surviving direct testimony from him, only records of brief interactions and a series of radio contacts that degrade in clarity as the evening progresses. From these, investigators built a tentative timeline. Earlier in the day, he is noted as having fueled his truck at a station south of the junction. The transaction amount suggests a nearly full tank, indicating preparation for an extended drive. The attendant, whose interview is now missing, originally provided a short description of Tristan's mood. In the summary that remains, it is reduced to a single phrase: appeared focused, not rushed. From the fuel station, he would have continued north along the main highway. A dispatch log from a regional coordinator indicates that he checked in by radio as he passed a known marker. The time is approximate, written down after the fact based on recollection of ongoing traffic. In that check-in, he confirmed his intention to take the logging road to the camp before full dark. The junction with the logging road has no camera coverage in that era. There is no toll booth, no automatic record of entry. However, a patrol unit passed the junction within an hour of his estimated arrival there. In the patrol notes, the driver remarks that fresh tire tracks were visible turning off the highway, headed toward the spur. No other vehicles were seen on that section of highway during that period. Once on the logging road, Tristan would have been driving slower. Photographs taken months later during a follow-up visit show the surface condition to be uneven, with scattered gravel and exposed clay. Puddles had expanded into wide patches, some spanning both lanes. The center crown was partially eroded, forcing vehicles into specific channels. The first recorded radio contact from Tristan on the road occurs near what the file calls Checkpoint 1. This is not a physical checkpoint, but an unofficial label for a culvert where signal typically fluctuated. Dispatch notations indicate that he reported entering the spur and encountering minor surface ice. He stated an estimated time of arrival at camp based on usual speeds, then signed off. Between that call and the next, the file records only environmental monitoring notes, wind speeds, temperature drops, and updated road condition cautions for a more southern route. For approximately 30 minutes, Tristan is simply a driver, moving deeper into darkness along a narrowing path, his presence inferred but not directly observed. No other vehicles report using the logging road during this window. The second contact is where the tone begins to shift. At a time that has been heavily redacted, a partial message from Tristan reaches dispatch. The surviving transcript includes only short fragments before and after gaps of static. Phrases like, "coming up on the fork and didn't recall this stretch being," remain cut off mid-sentence. This fork, once traced on maps, appears to correspond to the small unmarked junction noted earlier. Investigators later determined that an older access route left the main spur there, heading toward a decommissioned line of cut blocks. By the period of Tristan's trip, that older route would have been in poor condition, with no reason for regular traffic. Signage, if it ever existed, was gone. Dispatchers responding to Tristan's fragmentary call advised him to stay on the primary line, according to the notes. Their training emphasized caution with unmaintained side spurs, especially in shoulder seasons. In the file, a margin note points out that a standard reassurance was given, reminding him of the distance remaining and the presence of staff at camp. No concern is recorded at this stage. The third contact is the one that would later define the entire case. Its transcript, though incomplete, is the subject of multiple internal memos. It begins unremarkably, with Tristan reporting slowed progress due to worsening surface conditions. He mentions ruts freezing solid and the truck's rear end slipping on shaded sections. Then, the format of the transcript changes. Instead of straightforward phrases, there are lines indicating voice fading, overlapping sounds and repeated words. Several segments are entirely replaced with the word unintelligible in brackets, added later by whoever prepared the document. In between those blocks, a few phrases stand out. He refers to lights ahead, but the context is unclear. The original indicates that he repeated the term more than once, followed by a question about whether any crews were expected on the road that night. Dispatch replies, which would normally be recorded in a paired fashion, are barely present in the surviving file. One partial note suggests that he was told no active operations were scheduled. After this exchange, a silence follows in the log. The duration of that silence is one of the contested points in the investigation. Different internal reconstructions place it between 7 and 12 minutes. During that time, the dispatcher reportedly called Tristan's unit designation several times without response. When he finally comes back on the air, the tone of his voice is described in a missing statement as strained. Only the summary of that statement survives. It notes that he sounded distracted and that his sentences broke off unexpectedly. He again mentions lights, this time adding a directional reference inconsistent with his known position. This inconsistency is subtle but important. Based on where he should have been on the road, any lights from the camp would not yet be visible due to intervening tree lines and curves. There were no other permanent structures known to be in that section. A temporary survey crew had withdrawn weeks earlier, leaving no powered equipment. The dispatch log shows an attempt to clarify. A question is sent, asking him to confirm whether the lights are on the road or off in the bush. The reply is fractured in the surviving transcript. The words off and right are legible, but what follows is partially erased. A faint indentation suggests further description that has been physically removed. At some point in this exchange, a background noise is noted by the dispatcher. They describe it later as not recognizable as typical road or engine sounds. Without the audio, only this subjective description remains. The dispatcher mentions a periodic tone on the line, rising and falling in a way that did not fit known interference patterns. The last clear words attributed to Tristan on the transcript are simple. He acknowledges the dispatcher's instruction to hold his position and wait for further guidance. He states an intention to stop the vehicle and reassess. After that, the line goes open but silent, carrying only low-level static. There is no official record of any distress call, no use of specific emergency codes. The situation at that moment appears to have been ambiguous, unusual, but not immediately classed as life-threatening. The dispatcher had other traffic to manage, and the assumption, as later noted, was that Tristan was exercising routine caution in poor conditions. It would be some time before his lack of renewed contact was recognized as a deviation. At the camp, meanwhile, staff awaited his arrival with mixed expectations. In one partial statement, a crew member recalls assuming that he might delay until morning given the weather. Another recalls that a late arrival was common at season's end, when packing could stretch into the night. No one there reported immediate alarm when his anticipated time came and went. The first overt recognition that something might be wrong appears in the log as a brief note from dispatch to a patrol unit. They are asked when near the junction to check whether there is visible sign of a vehicle on the spur. By the time this instruction is given, darkness is complete and temperatures are falling. The patrol unit acknowledges but indicates it will be some time before they reach the area. What happens between Tristan's last confirmed transmission and the patrol's eventual arrival at the junction is the central gap in this case. No further messages from his radio reach the network. No other driver reports seeing his headlights or meeting another vehicle on that road. The forest absorbs whatever took place along those kilometers of gravel and ice. Later, during interviews, the dispatcher who handled his calls struggles to sequence their memories. Without full audio, their recollection becomes yet another contested document. In the surviving summary, they mention a sense, not immediate but growing, that something about his pauses and half-sentences was atypical. That sense hardened only when repeated attempts to raise him went unanswered. By the time the patrol unit reaches the junction and pauses, there is no visible indication at the highway that anything is wrong. The spur lies as it always has, a dark opening into the trees, its surface faintly reflecting the patrol's headlights. Tire tracks enter, but given recent light traffic, it is unclear how fresh they are. The choice is made to continue north on the main highway, postponing a deeper check until morning. The initial response to Tristan's disappearance was constrained by timing and assumptions. He was last heard from late in the day, with darkness already established. Weather, while challenging, was not extreme enough to trigger automatic emergency protocols. For the first several hours, his lack of contact was interpreted as a probable decision to remain stopped or to shelter in place. It was only when the camp confirmed, by their own rough schedule, that he had not arrived by morning that concern escalated. A radio call from the camp to dispatch notes his absence and inquires whether he had reported turning back. Dispatch, reviewing the previous evening's logs, realizes that his last contact had ended ambiguously. At that point, a search is formally initiated. The first step is a reconnaissance by road. A patrol truck is assigned to drive the logging road as far as conditions allow. Their notes from that day make up one of the longest continuous documents in the file. They describe entering the spur in early light, with overcast skies and intermittent sleet. For the first several kilometers, the road is as expected. Ruts, shallow puddles, and patches of ice correspond with previous descriptions. The patrol notes confirm the absence of any significant fresh tire marks beyond those of their own vehicle. Yet the surface in this segment had not accumulated enough new precipitation to fully erase older impressions. At approximately the distance of the first noted checkpoint, they observe faint evidence of a vehicle having pulled slightly to the side at some earlier time. The marks are degraded, their edges softened by melt and refreeze. Whether these belonged to Tristan's truck could not be determined even at the time. No associated debris, footprints, or disturbed vegetation is recorded. Continuing onward, the patrol reaches the area of the unmarked fork. Here, their notes become more detailed. They stop, exit the vehicle, and document the layout. The main spur continues ahead, while a narrower, more overgrown track diverges to the right. The side track shows no recent vehicle use. Grass and small shrubs in its center are unbroken, and a thin layer of frost lies undisturbed on its surface. Patrol officers, following standard practice, walk a short distance down this spur, scanning for footprints, track marks, or other anomalies. Finding none, they return to the main road and proceed. Just beyond the fork, there is a long, gentle curve corresponding to the one circled on the surviving map. Here, the patrol notes mention subtle irregularities. The surface shows signs of shearing, as if a heavy load had shifted sideways under momentum, yet there are no clear skid marks, no scar in the ditch where a vehicle might have left the road. They stop again, inspect both ditches and the tree line. The ditch on the right, in the direction of the curve's outer edge, slopes into a swampy hollow. Patches of thin ice cover standing water, with sedges and low shrubs protruding. No breaks in the vegetation suggest recent disturbance. On the left, the ditch rises quickly into a small embankment leading up to dense trees. The soil here is shallow over rock, with lichen-covered boulders and exposed roots. Again, no obvious sign of impact, scraping or crushed undergrowth is observed. The patrol officers remark on this, noting that if a vehicle had left the road here, some trace should remain. Continuing past the curve, they drive the remaining distance toward the camp. They pass the marsh indicated in earlier descriptions, its surface patchily frozen. At no point do they encounter Tristan's truck, nor any debris, nor any personal effects. When they reach the camp, the staff confirm that he had not arrived at any time during the night. The absence of the vehicle complicates the scenario. Standard explanations, such as mechanical failure or simple off-road excursion, become less convincing when no physical sign supports them. The possibility that he turned around or took an unintended route raises questions about where the truck might have gone. Yet the patrol's survey of the road shows no fresh tracks beyond the initial entry. Given these findings, the investigation shifts toward a broader search. Additional vehicles are assigned to recheck the logging road and adjacent old spur routes. Some sections are walked on foot where trucks cannot safely proceed. Weather during these days remains variable, but does not reach conditions that would explain sudden, catastrophic loss. Air support is requested, but limited by resource constraints. Eventually, a fixed-wing aircraft conducts a series of passes over the area. The pilot reports no visible sign of a stranded vehicle on the road, in obvious clearings or along accessible shorelines of nearby lakes. Tree cover in many segments, however, prevents comprehensive visual coverage. On the ground, search teams extend their attention to informal pullouts and widening along the road where a driver might have attempted to stop. They find fire rings used in previous seasons, scattered trash and abandoned equipment, but nothing attributable to Tristan. One flattened area near the marsh shows evidence of older heavy vehicle use, half reclaimed by grasses. No recent footprints are preserved in the saturated soil. As days pass, the focus gradually moves from finding a stranded driver to explaining the diverging accounts in the record. A technical review of the radio logs is undertaken. Specialists examine the remaining transcripts, compare them with infrastructure maps, and attempt to model signal coverage that night. Their report, now partially missing, concludes that while dropouts and distortion are expected, the specific pattern described in this case is unusual. They note that the intervals of clear speech and static do not align smoothly with known terrain obstacles. They also point out that the background tones described by the dispatcher are not readily explained by equipment malfunction. Without original audio, these observations remain speculative. However, they contribute to a growing sense that the communication anomalies are central rather than incidental. Parallel to the technical review, another line of inquiry examines the logging road's history. Old maintenance records, crew logs, and planning documents are pulled from various departmental archives. These reveal that the road had been built in stages, with some segments following older exploration lines. In one such document, an early surveyor mentions difficulties with compass readings in a particular low-lying area. This reference, while likely unrelated, captures the attention of those looking for patterns. The low-lying area in question corresponds roughly with the marsh adjacent to the marked curve. Later, some investigators will quietly connect this to anecdotal reports of radios behaving erratically in the same vicinity. Whether these stories predate the Muir incident or arise from it is difficult to determine. Interviews with former camp workers and drivers who frequented the road provide further context. Several recall feeling uneasy about the curve past the fork, describing it as a place where the forest seemed to draw closer. One mentions seeing, on more than one occasion, diffuse light in the trees beyond the ditch without an obvious source. None of these accounts were formally recorded at the time, only surfacing years later. The investigation also looks outward, considering whether Tristan could have left the road entirely after his last transmission. Possibilities include turning around, taking an unknown sidetrack, or intentionally departing for a different destination. His known commitments at the camp and his described temperament make voluntary diversion seem less likely, but not impossible. Without the vehicle, however, every hypothesis encounters the same obstacle. There is an effort to reconstruct his personal circumstances from available data. Financial records, contact lists, and previous work assignments are reviewed. They reveal nothing illegal or high risk. He appears as a person who moved between seasonal contracts, comfortable with isolation, but maintaining regular ties to a small network of colleagues and relatives. Those contacts, where reachable, express surprise at his disappearance but offer little insight into unusual behavior beforehand. A few mentioned that he had spoken casually about preferring late-season work, when the bush was quieter and tourist traffic minimal. Others recall that he took pride in his ability to handle long drives in marginal conditions. None recalled him expressing fear or reluctance toward the logging road itself. As days turn into weeks, the official search efforts scale back. File entries shift from daily updates to more sporadic notations. Occasional tips from travelers who believe they have seen an abandoned truck in various remote locations are checked and discounted. No confirmed sighting of his vehicle or person is ever logged. Then, months later, a brief, cryptic update is added to the file. It notes the receipt of an unlabeled audio tape delivered to a regional office. The tape reportedly contains a short segment of radio noise and fragments of speech that resemble the transcribed content from the night of the incident. There is no indication of who sent it or how they obtained the recording. The tape itself is no longer in the file. Instead, a typed summary describes its contents. According to that summary, the fragments align closely with the third contact previously transcribed, the one in which Tristan mentions lights. However, the summary adds that there are additional words present on the tape that do not appear in the older transcript. These additional words are the subject of redaction. A line in the summary states that certain phrases were deemed irrelevant or potentially misleading, and therefore not included in official records. Yet the phrase potentially misleading suggests that they carried implications someone considered uncomfortable or disruptive. What those implications were is now open only to interpretation. After the tape's arrival, internal correspondence increases briefly. Some staff argue for reopening active search efforts, particularly along lesser-known side routes. Others contend that without new geographic data, such efforts would be symbolic rather than effective. Resource limitations and shifting priorities eventually favor the latter position. Over time, the Muir file becomes a kind of administrative orphan. It remains technically open for a period, then is moved into an inactive category. Recommendations from the internal reviews lead to minor changes in radio protocol, such as more rigorous verification of last known positions. The specific circumstances of Tristan's disappearance, however, remain unresolved. Years later, during a separate review of unsolved cases, notes are added in a different hand. These marginalia question why certain pieces of evidence, including the unlabeled tape, were not preserved in more secure conditions. They also point out inconsistencies in page numbering and references to documents that no longer exist. The implication is that the file suffered not only from the uncertainties of the original incident, but from the decisions of those who handled it afterwards. Attempts to identify the source of the tape lead nowhere. Envelope records, if they existed, are missing. No one recalls opening the package or logging its arrival. It appears in the record as suddenly as it later vanishes. The investigation, as it stands in the surviving documents, therefore reaches no firm conclusion. It documents diligent but limited field searches, technical curiosity about unusual radio patterns, and growing unease about the completeness of the record. It circles repeatedly around the same geography, the same curve in the road, the same mention of lights where none should be. When a case lacks definitive evidence, theories proliferate. In the Muir file, these theories appear in different forms. Some are explicitly outlined in discussion papers, while others exist only as hints in marginal notes. All attempt, in their own way, to reconcile the disappearance of a man and his vehicle with the stubborn absence of physical trace. The most straightforward explanation considered is that of an unobserved departure from the road into terrain that later concealed the wreck. Despite patrol notes finding no such evidence, advocates of this view point to the limitations of the initial search. Snowfall and thaw cycles could have softened and obscured impact marks. A vehicle entering deep water or unstable muskeg might have left minimal above-surface disruption. Supporters of this theory focus on the marsh near the marked curve. They argue that if the truck had slid slowly rather than violently into that wetland, it could have broken through thin ice and settled into deeper channels. Subsequent freezing, combined with floating vegetation, might have masked any disturbance. Over years, accumulating organic material could further bury the remains. Counter-arguments note that trained searchers inspected that marsh's accessible margins soon after the disappearance. They found no signs of broken ice large enough to admit a full-sized truck. Additionally, aerial surveys, limited though they were, did not reveal telltale stains or unusual patterns often associated with submerged vehicles. Yet the marsh's interior complex channels remained largely unexamined, leaving room for uncertainty. A related hypothesis suggests that Tristan left the vehicle voluntarily after some road incident and became lost on foot. In this view, he may have attempted to walk either toward the camp or back toward the highway, misjudging distances in low visibility. Hypothermia, uneven terrain, and hidden water could have combined to claim his life. His remains, scattered by scavengers and concealed under forest litter, might easily evade detection. However, extensive ground searches along plausible walking routes failed to uncover any clothing, equipment, or remains. The absence of the vehicle also weakens this theory's explanatory power, as it requires both that he left it and that it was never found. Some propose a secondary event, such as theft or removal of the truck by an opportunistic passerby, yet traffic records and local knowledge argue against significant unlogged movement on that road in the relevant window. The notion of third-party involvement does appear in the internal review, though cautiously. Investigators consider whether another vehicle might have been present on the logging road that night without registering on official logs. Such a vehicle could belong to poachers, unlicensed resource extraction crews, or individuals seeking privacy for unrelated activities. A confrontation, intentional or accidental, could have contributed to Tristan's fate. In this scenario, his references to lights take on a different cast. He might have seen headlights or camp lights where none were expected, leading to his questions over the radio. Subsequent events involving those unknown parties could explain the abrupt end of transmissions. The lack of reported tire tracks or debris, however, again complicates matters. Some within the department were reluctant to formalize any theory implying human malice without stronger supporting evidence. The region, while remote, was not entirely unmonitored. Known groups operating in its margins tended to avoid drawing attention, not invited by interfering with official vehicles. Moreover, no rumors or whispers of forced encounters on that road surface in the surviving community-level recollections. A more structural theory looks less at individual actors and more at systemic behavior. It suggests that the real story of the Muir case lies partly in what happened to the file afterwards. According to this line of thought, early investigative missteps, miscommunications, or resource allocation decisions may have led to oversights. Faced with the prospect of acknowledging these errors, some officials might have chosen to minimize documentation. In this view, missing pages and redacted lines are not evidence of sinister external forces, but of internal discomfort. The unlabeled tape, then, could be a fragment preserved unofficially by someone uneasy with the official narrative. Its later removal from the file might represent a renewed attempt to tidy the record before it drew renewed scrutiny. The case becomes less a wilderness mystery than a quiet example of bureaucratic self-protection. Yet this explanation, while plausible as a framework for administrative behavior, does little to account for the core facts of Tristan's disappearance. Even if investigations were flawed, a truck and a body should, in principle, exist in physical space. Decades of hunters, trappers, recreational travelers, and maintenance crews have moved through that general region. The continued absence of any reported discovery associated with the case presses against purely procedural explanations. Among those who lived and worked along the northern highways, less formal theories circulated. Some spoke of certain stretches of road where compasses behaved oddly, where radios crackled without input, where light seemed to behave unpredictably. These stories, woven from a mix of observation and embellishment, often attached themselves to real events. The Muir disappearance offered a fertile anchor for such narratives. In these retellings, Tristan's mention of lights becomes less a literal observation and more a symbol. Listeners imagine eerie glows filtering between the trunks, inexplicable movement in the peripheral vision of a tired driver. Yet the documented case never describes anything overtly outside natural possibility. The transcripts refer only to lights, directionally ambiguous, and to a voice strained but comprehensible until it ceases. Some suggest that the terrain itself, with its mixture of reflective ice, low cloud and intermittent fog, could produce unexpected visual effects. Headlights may refract and scatter in ways that make distant vehicles or camps appear closer, higher, or off-axis. Moonlight, when present behind thin cloud, can create the illusion of sources within the forest rather than above it. A tired driver, aware of being alone and having limited experience with that specific road, could misinterpret such phenomena. Those inclined toward more speculative thinking extend this further, pointing to the early surveyor's comment about compass interference near the marsh. They imagine magnetic anomalies or subsurface deposits subtly affecting equipment. Radios, they argue, might react unpredictably in such zones, creating patterns of static and tone like those described by the dispatcher. Still, the lack of corroborating technical data limits such ideas to the realm of conjecture. Occasionally, a very different kind of theory surfaces in the margins of private correspondence. It suggests that the logging road and the camp at its end were used at some point for activities beyond timber extraction. Test plots, experimental installations, or sensitive storage are mentioned, though never with concrete specifics. If true, such use might explain an unusual degree of interest in controlling the narrative around any incident in the area. In that frame, Tristan's references to lights could be seen as accidental proximity to something not meant to be observed. His subsequent disappearance and the incomplete nature of the file might then be interpreted as linked responses to that proximity. However, no hard evidence of such operations exists in the accessible archives reviewed for this case. The theory remains founded more on gaps and redactions than on positive data. Ultimately, each theory must wrestle with the same stubborn realities. A driver equipped with a functioning vehicle enters a known spur road and communicates clearly for a time. He describes conditions, notes lights where none are logged, and agrees to stop. In the end, the file labeled with Tristan Muir's name occupies more space in the imagination than on the shelf. It is a slim object, light in the hand, its cover softened by decades of contact and storage. Inside, the remaining pages carry the marks of multiple eras of attention and neglect. Typewriter fonts from one decade share space with later ballpoint annotations and, finally, digital labels affixed to scanned copies. When held against the wider backdrop of northern disappearances, the case is both unremarkable and singular. People go missing in remote regions for reasons that are often banal in their origin. A misstep on ice, an engine failure at the wrong temperature, a misjudged turn on an unlit road. Yet the combination of partial evidence and unresolved anomalies around Tristan's last journey grants his story a persistent gravity. The logging road that structured the investigation no longer exists in a functional sense. Satellite imagery and field reports confirm that its surface has broken down, washed into ditches, and been overtaken by saplings. Only those who knew it when it was active can locate its path on the ground with any certainty. For others, it appears only as a faint recollection in archival maps and a few remaining photographs. The camp at the road's end has fared no better. Roofs have collapsed under snow loads, walls have buckled where permafrost shifts the supporting posts. Metal components, where not removed for scrap, rust quietly in the undergrowth. By now, there is little to distinguish the site from countless other abandoned industrial footprints scattered across the north. What cannot be reclaimed or eroded is the pattern of decisions that followed Tristan's disappearance. The delay in recognizing the severity of the situation, the limited scope of initial searches, the later handling of the file. These choices reflect the constraints and priorities of their time. They also reveal how easily a single life can become a logistical problem rather than a sustained focus. When the case was moved to inactive status, a brief handwritten note signaled the transition. It acknowledged that no new information had emerged despite periodic reviews and incidental patrol observations. The note recommended retention of the file for reference due to its unusual radio elements. Beyond that, there was no ceremony, no formal closure with family or colleagues recorded in the documents that survive. Years later, when a broader audit of historical missing person cases was conducted, the Muir file resurfaced. This time, rather than being quietly sent back to storage, it was flagged as an example of complex uncertainty. Auditors noted the interplay between physical landscape, technological limitations, and administrative practice. The case became less an object of active investigation and more a study in how certain events resist clear narrative. Reading the file today, the absence of a definitive ending is palpable. Each document gestures toward something beyond itself, a missing page, a lost tape, an unrecorded conversation. The remaining transcripts hint at voices cut short, static rising where words should be. Maps describe roads that no longer exist, their lines leading into blank spaces on current charts. Between these gaps, one can reconstruct only a modest core. A man familiar with northern work sets out toward a nearly abandoned camp. He travels along a lesser road in marginal weather, communicates intermittently with dispatch, and mentions unexpected lights. After agreeing to stop and wait, he is not heard from again. Theories about what happened to him say as much about those who propose them as they do about the facts. Some emphasize human error and the quiet dangers of overconfidence in remote places. Others highlight systemic blind spots, the ways institutions can fail individuals when conditions fall outside standard scenarios. A few, more speculative, project onto the case their own sense of the North as a place of unseen forces and unexplained events. The wilderness itself remains indifferent to all of this. The boreal forest that bordered the logging road continues its slow cycles of growth, death, and decay. Marsh water rises and falls with rainfall and snowmelt, freezing and thawing in yearly rhythm. Animals traverse paths once used by trucks, leaving tracks that disappear with the next weather change. In such a setting, disappearance can be both literal and metaphorical. Bodies, vehicles, and structures can vanish from ready human perception, absorbed into a vastness that does not mark individual loss. Records, too, can fade, whether through deliberate action, accident, or the simple entropy of storage systems. The Muir file, spared complete erasure only by a chain of small decisions, testifies to how fragile the documentary thread can be. When cases like this are revisited, it is rarely with the expectation of sudden revelation. Time hardens uncertainties and disperses witnesses. What can be gained instead is a clearer view of the context in which the disappearance occurred and the limitations of the responses at the time. That clarity does not answer every question, but it alters the lens through which the remaining fragments are seen. There is an ethical dimension to returning to these stories. They involve real lives, real families, real communities, even when names and details are coded or obscured. Treating them merely as puzzles risks overlooking the human weight carried in each page. At the same time, allowing them to sink fully into archival obscurity denies any possibility of learning from their unresolved nature. The Muir disappearance sits, therefore, in a narrow space between forgetfulness and fixation. It is not among the most widely discussed cases, nor does it form part of popular northern folklore. Most who knew Tristan personally have aged, moved away, or passed on themselves. What remains is a trace, a set of documents, and the persistent question of how a man and his truck could leave so little behind. In reviewing this case, one is left with a particular image. A late fall evening on a narrowing road, headlights pushing against mist and low cloud. Trees press close, their trunks catching and releasing light in fleeting patterns. Somewhere ahead, or perhaps off to the side, a glow appears where none is expected. A driver, alone, slows and reaches for the radio microphone. He speaks, describing what he thinks he sees, seeking confirmation that others know what lies ahead. Voices answer, distant and filtered through static, offering instructions conform to standard procedure. Between words, the line fills with small sounds that do not fit familiar categories. Then, at some point not clearly marked in any log, the connection ends. The road continues beyond that point, curving gently around a marsh, climbing slightly toward a camp, watching its final season. The forest stands the same as before, indifferent to a single absent vehicle among countless passing machines. In the file, the last entry for that night is a timestamp and a brief note about loss of contact. What happened in the unrecorded interval remains beyond the reach of the surviving archive. It may have been simple, a sequence of small misjudgments and unlucky timings. It may have involved other people, other vehicles, or the quiet intervention of conditions poorly understood at the time. The documents cannot say, and those who might have known chose or were forced to leave no full account. All that can be done now is to trace the remaining lines, to map the interplay of road, weather, technology, and human decision.